What is consensus on a blockchain? This video explores the properties of consensus, validity, and truth when it comes to blockchains. In this case, consensus happens when people collectively agree about the maintenance of a blockchain, including what is valid and not valid to post to a blockchain and whether those posts need to be true. Now, blockchain is an immutable distributed ledger, and for the purposes of this video, I think it's best to visualize this as a message board that's collectively owned and maintained by 100 people. And once someone posts something to that message board, you can never delete it unless the 100 people maintaining the message board agree to rewind the whole message board to the time before that post was made. That's the immutable part. To think about the distributed ledger part, the key is to understand that there's no central party that maintains or owns this message board. Most of the existing message boards like Reddit or Craigslist are owned by companies that have the power to change the rules or do whatever they want to with your posts whenever they want. And sometimes these message boards hand over some of that power to the current users, but that's never guaranteed. With our blockchain message board, on the other hand, the 100 people who are running it all have an independent copy of the message board on their own computer. And in order to add a post to that message board, those 100 people have to come to some kind of consensus that the post is valid. So what does it mean to be valid, and what is a consensus mechanism? Well, a consensus mechanism is just a procedure or process for coming to an agreement as a group, or consensus as a group, and probably the most common version of this is the majority rule vote. But a slight variation on that would be to have an 80% yes vote rather than just a 50% yes vote for it to be considered consensus. There are actually tons of different possible voting systems. Unfortunately, Arrow's impossibility theorem proves mathematically that there's no perfect voting system. And I'll post a link below about that theorem. But voting isn't the only way to reach consensus. It's one of the quicker methods we have, but there are slower methods for reaching a consensus. Scientific consensus, for example, happens over decades as researchers test and validate and invalidate each other's hypotheses until eventually some kind of consensus bubbles to the top that most scientists view as being self-evident. That's also a consensus mechanism. So what are some of the properties of consensus? Like, how do you know you've reached one? In this book, Kevin Warbach makes an interesting point about consensus. He says, consensus is achieved when those who disagree with the outcome agree to be governed by those who do. In which case, you have to ask yourself, what exactly does it look like to disagree with a blockchain consensus? Well, blockchain agreements and disagreements generally have to do with validity. If blockchain is a message board that's collectively owned and managed by 100 people, then what is a valid post to that message board? Well, that depends generally on what the 100 people want the character and purpose of their message board to be. In general, there's three big categories of validity. First, there's truth. That's validity. Second, there's validity relating to the rules that govern the message board. And finally, there's validity regarding the fulfillment of those rules. Now, the standards of truth-related validity, those can vary between message boards and they can vary between blockchains. Because some types of truths are harder to validate than others. For example, if you want to validate that 2 + 2 = 4, you can just have a machine validate that for you. Similarly, if someone wants to post, "I give 10 Bitcoin to my sister," all you need to do is validate that they actually have 10 Bitcoin by doing the math and going through all the past posts related to Bitcoin transactions to add up how much they actually have. That's pretty simple to do, and a computer can do it for you. But if you're an academic researcher or you're a journalist, you know how difficult it can be to validate truth sometimes. Consider validating each of these statements as true or false. Ginny Weasley graduated with a degree in computer science from Washington University. Lady Bertram has achieved competency in accounting skills. This supply of medications has passed quality inspections according to the FDA standards. Cornelius Fudge has never lied on the political campaign trail. Research shows that butterbeer causes cancer. What kind of evidence would be sufficient for you to vote yes, that's true, to each of those statements? And how much effort are you willing to put into validating each one? Well, most of the current cryptocurrency-related blockchains use versions of the truth that are pretty easily validated using just math and a computer. If you look at other applications of blockchain that people are trying to develop at the moment, you find versions of the truth that are less easily verified. But in some cases, it doesn't matter that much if things are perfectly true. As an example, take supply-side blockchains where you track the product from its inception. The messages written onto the blockchain along the way might look like these. Coffee beans harvested on July 31st. Coffee beans purchased by merchant on August 5th. Coffee beans passed the USDA inspection at the US border on August 18th. Coffee beans passed the Pete's quality assurance on September 1st. It's always possible that one of these statements is a lie. Maybe Farmer Martin picked the beans on July 27th and just didn't write it onto the blockchain until July 31st. Maybe Marianne Dashwood does a sloppy job of her quality inspection at Pete's and doesn't check every bag of beans. Who knows? But the level of truth on that blockchain is good enough without any extra verification. When we say that these entries onto the blockchain are valid, that's not exactly the same thing as saying they're 100% true. So when people call blockchain the truth machine, that's a slight exaggeration. But records like this hold up in court all the time. And at least with blockchain, you got a nice timestamp. If we think about our blockchain message board moderators, they have to come to a consensus about what kind of verification is necessary for a post to be valid. And that's a judgment call that involves weighing the importance of extra verification against the cost, which might be effort cost or it might be financial cost. How much truth do you need in this particular message board? Well, the moderators can set their rules according to that. Which leads us to the second type of validity that the moderators of this message board need to come to consensus about, and that is the rules to post to the blockchain. The moderators get to decide what kinds of posts are okay and not okay. Like, is it okay to post lies? Is it okay to use the Lord's name in vain? Is it okay to make threats? Is it okay to make offensive jokes? If they want to allow anyone to post anything, that's okay. If they want to require 2 forms of government-issued ID to post, they're allowed to do that. It's their collective space, and they decide together about its purpose. It's a little like Congress sets the rules for our country. The people that I'm calling the moderators of this blockchain, they set the rules that govern the blockchain. And anytime you have rules, you need enforcement. Which brings us to our third type of consensus around validity. That is consensus about what kinds of posts fulfill the message board's rules. If number 2 is like Congress, then this one's more like the Supreme Court coming to a consensus about whether something's legal or whether it's constitutional. In our message board example, this is a little bit like the moderators trying to decide if one particular off-color joke violates the rules to be respectful. You might imagine the message board moderators taking a majority rule vote, that is, a consensus mechanism, to try to decide whether to allow or disallow a particular kind of post. And of course, this type of consensus relates to shared values that they're trying to uphold on that forum. In a lot of ways, truth is a subcategory of this third type of validity. If a blockchain has a rule that only true statements can be posted, then there needs to be some kind of mechanism to determine if it's true. Of course, if validating the truth is too hard, then the truth can be Malfoy said Potter cheated on his exam. And whether or not it's factually true that Potter cheated on his exam, you can validate that Malfoy said that. You just give Malfoy his own private stamp of approval that he can use when he posts to a blockchain, in which case it's up to Malfoy to prove his credibility. Now, it's possible to have either on-chain or off-chain ways of determining validity. For example, imagine a blockchain whose only purpose is for people to post their university degrees and master's degrees and official degrees like that. One way of running a blockchain like that would be to say that the only people who can post onto this blockchain are people who are official university registrars. That would be fairly simple, and it would be a good way of ensuring that everything posted to that blockchain was true. A second way of handling the same blockchain would be to say that anybody can post anything they want to about a degree they have, but that the post won't be valid until a university registrar goes through and puts her stamp of approval on your post. We might imagine that one of the rules of this blockchain forum would be that all posts need to take the form, "I, Neville Longbottom, received a master's degree from Herbology University on June 20th, 2020. Then the moderators of this message board would go through and give every university registrar a free stamp that they could go use to stamp their approval on any post that matches their records. Now, each of these two setups for running this message board has advantages and disadvantages. The first mechanism may seem a lot more efficient at first glance, but it doesn't have any mechanism built in to incentivize the registrars to upload their records. The registrars might want to be paid for their effort, and who's going to pay their fee? The second mechanism might offer a better way to figure out who's going to pay. You could use smart contracts so that the people who wanted their degrees posted would be the ones to chip in. For example, maybe when Neville writes his credential on that blockchain, he also writes up a Kickstarter-style smart contract. I pledge to pay $5 toward the registrar's validation fee if enough people also agree to pay $5 to fully cover the $400 fee. Neville may not be willing to pay the full $400 fee for the registrar, but maybe he's willing to pay $5 or $2 or whatnot, and a bunch of other people feel the same way. And if you don't like that particular contract, there's other contracts you can do. I'll split the $400 bill equally with everyone else who wants their degree validated, just as long as my share of that is less than $10. The point is, there are lots of ways of setting up smart contracts to incentivize on-chain validation. Finally, we should acknowledge that the maintenance of this blockchain message board I've been talking about throughout this video, and the decisions about what's valid and not valid to go on the message board, that can all bring up deeply held values and beliefs and strong opinions. Because of that, it's entirely possible that there may be irreconcilable differences in opinion among the moderators of the forum. To reach consensus, as we talked about before, the people who lose the consensus mechanism vote, those people have to agree to abide by the rules of the winners of that vote. Well, it's possible that the losers have such deeply held convictions that they're not willing to do that. And if that happens, blockchain offers another option, which is forking. Forking a blockchain basically means that the two warring parties who disagree on something, they each take an identical copy of the message board they've been maintaining, and they part ways. And each group has their own little unique twist on the rules, so it's a little bit like a church split. And the fact that blockchain allows this to happen so seamlessly, that's one important feature of blockchains. To summarize, here are some important features of consensus and validity on blockchains. Valid is not the same as true. There are many different types of consensus mechanisms, not just majority rule. There are many different ways of determining validity. There is a trade-off between verification of the truth on the one hand and effort or cost on the other hand. Ultimately, blockchain may need creative ways to build in incentives for people to validate truth, and that might include financial incentives. If people disagree too much about the values behind a particular consensus they are trying to reach, they always have the option to fork the blockchain and part ways. In any case, I hope this video has helped you to think more clearly about consensus and validity on blockchains.